So next discussion now, tensions between the U.S. and China continue to simmer even as both sides agreed to a temporary reduction in tariffs. What's the real impact on China's economy and how resilient is it in the face of mounting pressure? To unpack this, we're joined by John Ashbourne. He's a director, emerging market economics at Fitch Solutions. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, with the U.S., walking back some of those heavy Trump-era tariffs, does this take some pressure off China's economy, or are there deeper trade wounds already done?
It certainly takes some of the pressure off. So the numbers that were announced earlier in April, we're seeing U.S. tariffs on China of over 120%. It's really important to stress that that's just an absolutely ludicrous number for a tariff. It's incredibly high. You don't see that almost anywhere in the world. So moving down to 40%, which is still high, but is no longer out of the bounds of what you might see, that will provide a bit of a boost to the Chinese economy, or I guess we could say remove a headwind. I mean, at Fitch Solutions, we think that the Chinese economy will grow by probably up 4.5% this year, which is not a great performance by China, though, of course, compared to most countries, quite a strong one.
And we see, China cuts tariffs on one hand, but tightens, rare earth controls with the other. Is that a clever balancing act, or could it, backfire economically?
Well, actually, I think it's an incredibly good card for China to play, and it really underlines how dependent most of the world is on China's rare earth processing. And the interesting thing to really keep in mind here is that manufacturing industries in the US and Europe and Japan are all dependent on China's rare earths. But China doesn't actually make a lot of money selling rare earths. Their total exports of rare earths last year were less than $1 billion. So when the Chinese turn off the tap for this, they don't experience much pain themselves, but it causes really serious or problems for manufacturers elsewhere. It's actually a pretty painless card for them to play compared to tariffs, which of course hurt both sides.
And, we've seen companies like Apple, slowly shift away from China. Is Beijing losing its grip as the world's factory floor? And what does what does that, mean for the economy if this trend, actually continues? Because I've heard, some instances of, China is already losing that ground at this point with some companies, moving out their factories from China.
Well, you're absolutely right that some foreign companies are moving away or they're trying to diversify. They'll produce in China, but also in other countries. Apple's a good example of that. But it's important to remember that that's only the foreign country companies that are active in China, and that's actually quite a small share of China's whole manufacturing base. So even if it's the case that, Apple will be the biggest example, but the other American, the other Japanese companies that build in China decide to build more of their products in Vietnam or in India, even if that happened, it doesn't affect the vast majority of China's manufacturing, which is local companies. And so China is the world's biggest producer of manufactured goods by far, over twice the US and Germany. So most of that is domestic. A lot of it's aimed at the local market. And even if it's aimed for exports, it's made by local companies. So fundamentally, even if the Japanese and the American and the European companies that have invested in China were to diversify, were to move away, that's a little bit unfortunate for China, but it isn't a huge problem because they've got this huge domestic industry and that's not going anywhere.
So, how much of this trade tension do you think the Chinese economy can take, at this time before it cracks or before we start to see some cracks, especially in exports and, manufacturing? Or is the China economy, strong enough to absorb all of this?
It's a pretty strong economy. I mean, there's a lot of problems. So we could look at the real estate sector, for instance, consumer spending, but it's important to remember that China's economy just isn't as dependent on exports as it was 10 or 20 years ago. I think people have often quite a backwards looking view of the Chinese economy. If you look at China in 2005, this was a poor country that mostly got its growth by producing goods for rich consumers in America, in Europe, elsewhere. China in 2025 is a much richer country. They produce a lot for their own use. They have a huge domestic market. Even if they don't export much to the US, they can still export. For one thing, they can produce for domestic use, but also they can export to the rest of the world. They export a huge amount to Southeast Asia. They export a huge amount to Africa. So the capacity of the US to really put a block on their growth is much smaller than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 20% of what China exported, they sent to the US. Today, it's less than 10%. So these create headwinds. They'll slow growth. As I said, our forecast is growth of 4.5%. That would be lower than the government's forecast. That would be much lower than we've seen in recent years. But growth of 4.5% hardly a disaster. This is still an economy that has a lot of objective strengths to it and that still has a pretty positive outlook.
All right, so definitely, I know you track, most of these economies and countries, but, with what we're seeing, the global space right now between China and the U.S., do you think there's an underdog country, sitting in the corner that has potential to step in here and profit?
Mm. Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that's probably the billion-dollar question for a lot of people. There's probably a few. So if you look at what happened during the trade war that Donald Trump had against China during the first time he was president, so back in 2019, one of the big winners of that was Vietnam. Because when the US put tariffs on Chinese goods, Vietnam really ramped up production of the same products and they sold them to US consumers. And of course, it was cheaper for the Americans to buy the Vietnamese good than the Chinese one because of the tariff difference. And this was a real boon to Vietnam, similarly Cambodia, a few other Southeast Asian countries. Now, it might be harder to play that kind of game this time because the US is putting tariffs on everybody, not just on China, and they might crack down on goods sort of being redirected. But yeah, this certainly creates opportunities, mostly I'd say in Southeast Asia, but potentially in Mexico, in other countries that have the capacity as manufacturers to produce goods that American consumers are used to getting from China and that'll now be more expensive. There's also some possibility even in Africa, if we look at textiles. Obviously, AGOA, the trade agreement between the US and Africa, is probably not going to be continued, and that's very bad news. But with a big tariff on Chinese goods, that might make it more competitive if you're producing textiles, other things in Ethiopia and in Kenya, even Lesotho. So there are opportunities everywhere. The China-US relationship is a huge amount of trade. The trade between just Chinese exports to the US is about $600 billion in 2024. So if you disrupt that, if you stop that flow of money going and that money has to find somewhere else to find those goods, there's a lot of that to go around. And so even if a fairly small country like a Cambodia, a Kenya is able to grab a pretty small fraction of that's real money for an economy that's not the size of China. So there's opportunities there. It's hard to see exactly who'll win, but I'd point to Southeast Asia probably being best placed.
All right, we'll definitely be watching out, for that. John Ashburn, thank you so much for coming on today. He's the Director, Emerging Market Economics at Fitch Solutions. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much.